Hi, Mikhael.
Hi, Bob. How you doing?
Good. How unsuccessful an attempt was that to pronounce your first name?
Just relatively successful, I guess. It was actually pretty good.
Compared to other American attempts.
Yes.
From now on, I think for simplicity, I'll call you Mikhael or something. But your last name...
That works as well.
Your last name is Manekin, like
Yes.
the doll, but not spelled that way. You are in
True.
Israel,
Yeah.
where I met you this summer because you are co-director now of Breaking the Silence.
Yes.
And you were taking us on a tour of the West Bank. You want to tell us what Breaking the Silence is?
Sure. Breaking the Silence is an organization of veterans of the Israeli military. We all served in the IDF post-2000, so post what we call here Second Intifada, in the occupied territories. What we try to do is use our experiences as soldiers to try to educate people on the consequences of occupation, what occupation is, what the problems with it are, why we think it's a problematic policy. That's the organization, and we do two things. The first is that we collect and publish soldier testimonials. Up until today, we've spoken with around 800 veterans. And we publish them in various different outlets. And the second thing that we do is that we educate. We guide tours. We give lectures. Actually, to quite a few young Israelis. I think we reach something like 7,000 or 8,000 a year. So that's the organization.
Now, we should first of all plug your book. There's a book, I think, called Breaking the Silence, right?
It was called Breaking the Silence or Occupation of the Territories, and it's actually coming out officially. I mean, we had sort of a first run, but it's coming out officially in bookstores in the U.S. in this coming August, and I think they're still working on the title.
Okay, but what is the book that was already reviewed by, for better or worse, from your point of view, Elliot Abrams in Foreign Affairs?
Right, so that's the one. I mean, that was
Okay.
the first run of it. It just didn't hit bookstores yet.
Mm-hmm.
It was. I mean, it was Breaking the Silence first attempt to. We've been doing this for 7 years already, and I think we realized at some point that we have the ability to give a bigger picture of what is happening in the territories, and not only to talk about a specific incident there or a specific incident here. So the book really tries to analyze what it is that ground forces have been doing in the occupied territories over the last 10 years. A lot of people say words like occupation, but don't really know what that means. I think there are a lot of misconceptions, and the book really tries to outline what occupation, what are the dynamics on the ground of military rule.
Okay. And what is it that people don't know? I mean, what silence is being broken? What are you trying to bring to the attention of even the Israeli public? I mean,
Sure.
leave aside what Americans may not know, but what is not known about the costs in any sense of the occupation?
Well, I mean, I think it's sort of different answers for different audiences. I mean, obviously the main amount of work that we do is with Israelis, and when we thought of the name Breaking the Silence in regards to our society, our understanding as veterans, and maybe I should say in that context, I mean, I was just recently promoted to captain. I was a lieutenant in the infantry between 1998 and 2002, and I'm still in the reserves. Obviously, there are a lot of Israelis who are serving in the military, so there's an understanding that people serve. But it was our understanding or our feeling when we started the organization in 2004 that people don't like talking about the non-heroic parts of being a soldier. And when you're an administrative police officer, in a way, in the territories, there's a lot of non-heroic parts. So that's Breaking the Silence. In the international context, and definitely regarding our book, I think there's an understanding, a misconception, or maybe an international fantasy that the occupation is temporary, or at least that there's, other than some glitches, some sort of linear progression towards Palestinian independence or towards the end of Israeli occupation. And what the book tries to debunk is exactly that. We're trying to show that the way the military is behaving is as if this occupation is going to go on for generations and generations to come, and we need to come to grips with that reality.
Yeah, I must say, you were part of a pretty unpleasant mood swing that I experienced in Israel. I really think it was in conversation with you that I really started to think it was too late for a two-state solution. And the epiphany I had was when you described the way, it's misleading. You didn't say this, but this was what my takeaway. It's misleading to look at a map and see these dots that are settlements and think that that's kind of the extent to it, because there is an infrastructure connecting the settlements consisting of roads and things. And from a Palestinian point of view, those are often really difficult obstacles. If there's a road built, it may be that Palestinians can't cross it except at certain checkpoints. And I realize that, settlers, they have the ability to kind of establish de facto outposts that wind up over the course of time being accepted in effect by Israel as legitimate. And once they've achieved that, well, then there has to be a road to them or whatever, right? I mean, so it's not a bunch of dots, it's a web. And it just seems to me much more deeply entrenched than I had realized. Is that a fair understanding of the situation?
Well, it's a fair understanding. I come to different conclusions, but I would say, even in terms of the understanding, I would say, aside from the fact that we're talking about a large structure, which is not, as you say, it's not only those dots, but the roads connecting them, and you can add on to that water and electricity and all sorts of different levels. Breaking the silence doesn't only focus on the settlement issue, it's the whole control mechanism issue, which is that sort of our international relations with the Palestinians is that we're in control of them. And I think that's something that sometimes sort of skips the international attention. We're in control of every aspect of Palestinian life. And even if we're not actually sitting in their cities and we've just moved out and we've moved a checkpoint from this point to that point, we're just doing that because we've learned how to control them better, and not because we're giving them more control over themselves. Meaning we always need to have that grip over the Palestinian population, and that's really what the message of Breaking the Silence is about. That doesn't, where I differ from in the conclusion, and this is, first of all, maybe I should, it's important for me to say that, in terms of Breaking the Silence, we spell out the situation. We don't say what the solution should be, and it's very important for us. But it is important to say that the fact that we're very much entrenched doesn't mean that it's impossible to leave. And secondly, if we're talking about solutions or options, it definitely doesn't mean that if we're already entrenched that we should stay there in a different political climate. If you look at things like a one-state climate or whatever, I know this is a different conversation, but if I look at things from a military perspective, if you even thinking about sort of a one-state framework where we have a joint framework, a joint military with the Israelis and Palestinians is I think today at this given time so fantastical that it becomes much more relevant to talk about moving out than integrating in.
Although, see, my sense was while there that it's just about as fantastical to imagine Israel moving from its current political psychological framework to a framework where it would have the political will to do what would actually be necessary to extricate itself from the occupied territory sufficiently to give the Palestinians a state worth having.
Well, I would agree with that assessment. Obviously, one has to ask the question, if we keep on saying that everybody wants to go towards a two-state solution, and why isn't it happening? And obviously, the answer is lack of political will. I think Breaking the Silence tries to challenge that political will, maybe a bit naively, in the sense that we're focusing in sort of the immoral aspects of controlling another people. I'm not naive in the sense that I know that that's only one way of of convincing people, and they're, I imagine when God willing, the occupation will end. It will end for a lot of reasons. But for us also, I mean, it's our responsibility and our duty as veterans is to shed a light on the issues which we had personal connections with.
Uh-huh. Okay. So leaving aside the question of whether it's too late for a two-state solution, the other thing I was struck by when I was there, not so much in conversation with you, partly in conversation about you, to be honest, with other Israelis, but is that seems to be a significant. I mean, if I lump you along with other people who you might say are on the kind of human rights left in Israel and focus on issues involving the Palestinians. Another such group would be Solidarity, which focuses on East Jerusalem. The sense I got was that there's a fairly active attempt to marginalize you and even depict you as traitorous. Is that fair? I don't mean is it fair to depict you as traitorous. I mean, is it fair to say that there's an attempt to depict you as traitorous?
No, I mean, and first, it should be said that I'm sort of past the point on a personal level and definitely organizationally that we feel sort of a need to look at ourselves in the mirror and tell ourselves that we're okay. When we've come to a point where sort of active reservists and veterans and combat veterans and people who have actually risked their lives because they're actually, saying the political opinion, which is not sort of the dominating political opinion, are considered traitors. So there's a certain point where we say, okay, I don't want to partake in that element of the conversation. Mm-hmm. Of course, on the level of Israel atmosphere, and I think this is very much it's very much pushed by the administration. There is an attempt, both publicly and also legally, to try to stop our organizations from working publicly by, you say you sort of were hesitant when you said traitorous. Victor Lieberman, our minister of Foreign Affairs, called my organization terrorists in the Knesset. So we can. Wow. This is the language that's being used, and we're not talking about some sort of, so it might be good for sort of a very small organization's ego that the foreign minister is talking about us in the Knesset. But
I'd love to be called something like that by Hillary Clinton. That would do wonders for my profile.
I'm not sure Hillary Clinton would like to be, sort of parallel to Victor Lieberman. No,
it's the job description I was thinking of.
Fair enough. Look. It's so while we can laugh about it, and I think the sort of the psychology of the organization is we tend to laugh about it. Obviously, these are things which are very, very troubling. First and foremost, because I want to live in a democracy and I want to live in a place where there's freedom of speech and so on, and also because I want to have the ability to have an effect on policy in my country. If you zoom out from that, now that's the case, I think, probably for all human rights organizations which are working today on the occupation issue, and breaking the silence is one of the main examples for this, but it's definitely hitting all the other organizations. Mm-hmm. I think what should be said in this is that if I'm self-critical for a second, or at least critical of my camp, is that we don't have the structural, human rights organizations such as Breaking the Silence don't have structural capacity to deal with these attacks against us. If we're doing our job well, we're getting credible information out to the public about things which we think are wrong. That's not a political camp. That's a function, a civil society function, which we think is helpful. What should have happened in the scenario where we're being attacked is, left-wing parties or liberal parties or progressive parties should have been fighting for us out there in government and out there in the media. And the fact of the matter is that they've completely fallen apart. So what you have in Israel today is structurally sort of no liberal, political movements and human rights organizations which are left there on their own to fend for themselves, where we don't really have any capacity to do so, nor do we want to.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there a kind of a speech code? In other words, are there things you have to be careful about not saying because you will be playing into their hands and it will be easier for them to depict you as traitors or terrorists or whatever?
Well, by their rule book or by our rule book?
Well, to the extent that their rule book works, I would think that's the one you might pay some attention to.
Well, sometimes. I mean, and also, I think the benefits of being post-combat is that our risk, our risk assessment and our risk management are a bit different than others, and somebody attacking me in Knesset doesn't really get me too nervous, sort of with my life experiences. The things that we don't do, and maybe people don't know this, but we all of the information that we publish, we actually hand over on our own. We hand over to the military censor first. We want to make sure that as we're publishing the information, we're not hurting state security. So, we get access to a lot of information. All that information, and again, without need, all that information goes to the military censor. So that's the limitations that we place on ourselves, and of course the limitations of reliability. We're only going to publish this information which is true.
But I mean, for example, ways you characterize the occupation, like in America, the use of the term apartheid will get you into a lot of trouble, and there are other red lines that you're not supposed to cross. And I mean, the question of whether apartheid is apt is a complicated question that maybe we could discuss. But but that's an example. I mean, are there terms that you are wiser to avoid?
Well, obviously, but I mean, the real answer would be that we try to not use descriptive words at all. I mean, if anybody's ever seen Breaking the Silence, and we have a website and all the testimonies are up there, we try to do as little analysis as possible, and only in the sense that it structures the testimony that's being given. So we're not. I don't feel a need to say a word like apartheid. I mean, and again, we can discuss later about the relevancy of that word and what happens when you say that word in the U.S. versus what happens when you say that word in Israel, because they're very, very different. But regarding us, I wouldn't use apartheid just because I don't want to interpret the soldier for him. But if a soldier will say the word apartheid, and a soldier can also say words which are worse than apartheid, I'll publish that because I'm a mouthpiece for him, and I'm not. If I start tampering with testimonies to see what fits into what fits in the framework of what audiences are aware of and what audiences want and what audience wouldn't want, that wouldn't be fair towards the soldier. We don't do even almost any copy editing towards soldiers. So sometimes the testimonies are even hard to read. In the sense that we don't restructure their sentences. It's an audio testimony which we transcribe and we publish. That's whereas conservative as one gets on that.
I actually remember you being circumspect about the question yourself when I was in Hebron with you, and and we were walking along a street that Israeli Jews are allowed to walk on, and that the Arabs who live in Hebron are not allowed to walk on. And they were, in fact, you could kind of see them walking along a not nearly so well maintained path that had its ups and downs on a hilltop on a ridge above. I said to you, so this is the people who argue that this is apartheid. This is the kind of thing they would point to. You've got a road, and I remember you pointed out that actually there are aspects of apartheid that don't, such as legal prohibitions on intermarriage and so on. So I know it's your.
Look, I mean here. Look, if we analyze it sort of cool-headedly for a bit, when somebody says a situation is apartheid or not apartheid, they're not trying to say this is historically an historically accurate reference. First of all, what they're saying is the situation is very bad and undemocratic, and that's the word that they use to describe these kinds of unequal situations. And there are aspects, of course, which are reminiscent, yes or no. I mean, and this is something, and again, I don't feel and politically, tactically, to be honest. I think the problem is with using that sort of rhetoric in the framework of our organization, that it starts becoming sort of this back and forth dynamic. Well, is it exactly apartheid, yes or no? Which, frankly, I think is an uninteresting conversation. I mean, when I walk in Hebron, I feel awful because the situation is wrong and immoral, and that doesn't mean it's like or dislike apartheid. It just means it's bad.
Yeah.
So I don't want to spend, when I'm trying to show people Hebron, or when my organization is trying to show people, the areas are in Ramallah or whatever, we want to focus on. I mean, we have a respect for our audiences in the sense that we understand that when we take them to a certain place and tell them how it works, they'll understand why it's problematic. Regarding, though, if we already mentioned the situation of Hebron and apartheid, and this is where I think the relationship, the amount of conversation which is happening in Israel versus the amount of conversation in the U.S. I mean, we had a piece last year by the legal analyst of Yediot Achronot, which is Israel's largest paper and by no means a left-wing paper, who said that the situation in Hebron is apartheid.
That's the one owned by Sheldon Adelson, or not? The one?
No, that's not Sheldon Adelson. That's the new free paper. Okay. We're talking about. No, Yediot Achronot is sort of the mainstream, middle of the road newspaper.
Not far right. Okay.
No, but there you still have it. But we're not talking about Haaretz, which is sort of a left-wing or liberal piece where you'll see the word apartheid all the time. We're talking about a legal analyst, a guy who's a former head of the courts. Who was talking about Hebron as apartheid. So I do think from what I read about what's happening in the U.S. as well, when somebody says that in Yediot Achronot, he's not called an anti-Semite or anything like that. It's considered part of the discourse.
And when you say from what you read is happening in the U.S. itself, you mean recent stuff or generally?
No, well, also, there are always the recurring themes. I think their most recent stuff was the attacks on the Center for American Progress on the bloggers who were. I think one of the attacks were there was the Israel Firster thing, if I remember correctly, and then there was the one of the bloggers who used the word apartheid to describe Israel, and that was sort of out of the game, and they got criticized a lot for that. And if you read that from an Israeli perspective, that's just nonsensical. I mean, I'm not even talking about legal analysts. I mean, our prime ministers have said that.
You mean it's nonsensical to call that out of bounds?
Of course. I mean, of course, it's nonsensical to call it out of bounds. I mean, in the Israeli context, you have very high-level people and very mainstream people, and sometimes people on the right. Who use this terminology because it's very much there. It's been there for 6 or 7 years. So, I mean, this term, other terms as well. This is before we were talking about the theoretical, questions of whether or not there are words which you're allowed to use or not allowed to use. I mean, specifically, these words are being used in Israeli discourse all of the time. So it strikes me as odd that would be considered out of bounds outside of the country.
Yeah. So this, for people who don't know, is a controversy. It's been simmering at a fairly low level, I'd say, for some time. Apparently, there's a piece that's going to come out in the Washington Post about it. And then last night or yesterday, there was an opinion piece in the New York Post, the very conservative New York Post, written by someone from Commentary who was very much indicting the Center for American Progress. And you're right about, I think, the main allegations. A junior person at CAP tweeted on their individual Twitter account, their personal account, but using the word Israel Firster to describe somebody.
Right.
And he's apologized. And then there was an apartheid reference that she mentions. And then she mentions a separate thing where somebody at CAP called the blockade of Gaza and the Israeli occupation, quote, a moral abomination. And that apparently was going too far. I mean, of course, you can argue about whether it is, but I mean, apparently, the argument here is, I think, that to even profess that opinion is to be, right, as I understand it, anti-Israel and even anti-Semitic. I mean, of course, that's the bottom line on these allegations, is that in all of these cases, this is being taken as evidence of anti-Semitism.
Right. I mean, look. First of all, look. I'm a combat veteran and an Israeli patriot, and I think that what's happening in the occupied territories is a moral abomination. So let's get that out of the way. I don't think those two in my mind sort of fit very well together. I actually think part of the reason I think it's a moral abomination, or part of the reason why it's so important for me, is because I'm an Israeli patriot. But more importantly, and I think when we look at these attacks, and they're very, very similar and sometimes orchestrated by the same groups as the organizations who are attacking us in the country. I mean, we're talking about it's very clearly people who support a right-wing agenda, yet instead of attacking us for supporting a left-wing agenda, they're demarcating what the boundaries of the conversation should be. Which is absurd, because why should somebody who's my political adversary decide for me what my political language should be and what it shouldn't be? And if you notice, all of these attacks are always sort of, depending on how nuanced the attackers are, but always the undercurrent is somewhere between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. So when you're saying, what you're really saying is anti-Semitic, and a lot of times what we get from the same attackers is, you're speaking fine, but Muslims are hearing you here and Muslims are hearing you there, and it's sort of appealing to another negative sentiment. We've been going through these attacks for years. I would say definitely since Operation Cast Lead in 2009, but even beforehand. And at some point, it's not an issue of frustration. I think there's sort of an unequal dialogue here, because they're not only are they saying we're promoting an agenda, they're also saying we're also going to say what the court is, and we're also going to say what's out of bounds. Mm-hmm. And we don't say that from our side. So the conversation is constantly tilting to the right. And our opinion in this is that there needs to be some sort of attack back, because you can't just constantly be on the defensive. At some point, you are delegitimizing yourself.
Would you say it's the same people or the same groups or something that are trying to enforce the speech code in the United States and in Israel? Do you mean that in a specific sense, and in terms of identifying?
Yeah, I mean, look, if I remember correctly, the first attacks on CAP also included NGO Monitor, who sort of, in Israel signals, there are always these watch groups and monitor groups, but obviously they're only monitoring sort of a specific side. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely that, but it's a whole rhetoric and discourse of sort of, today what we're promoting is the party line at this point being Bibi Netanyahu or the coalition's line. I mean, people forget, oddly, that even though, I'm obviously in the minority camp at this point, we represent a sizable portion of Israeli society who have different opinions on where Israel should go for, mm-hmm. What Israel should go for. And a lot of the rhetoric, and definitely in the U.S. context when speaking on Israel, the rhetoric is actually very, very moderate compared to the rhetoric which you hear in Israel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The whole thing kind of started, it was funny, with a piece in Politico by Ben Smith reporting, the lead was, two of the Democratic Party's core institutions are challenging a bipartisan consensus on Israel and Palestine that has dominated American foreign policy for more than a decade. It was a reference to Center for American Progress and Media Matters. So it was kind of reporting a controversy that I think no one had been especially aware of. I think in retrospect, it's true that there had been more criticism of Israeli policy on the CAP blogs, Center for American Progress blogs, and certainly by Media Matters, than is common with an institution as closely identified with the Democratic Party as CAP is. Right. But it wasn't an issue until you got this story in Politico. And one of the people quoted was Josh Block, former AIPAC, I think, spokesperson, and a Democrat. And then there was a subsequent iteration where it turned out that Josh Block, it kind of gave you reason to think that Josh Block had kind of worked hard to initiate this whole thing, because what was uncovered was an email of his. I don't know, did you see this thing in Salon, this email of his that was like I guess when this came out, he had his indictment ready, and it had appeared on some list that was ideologically simpatico for him, and it was an exhortation to get out the troops and drive the stake through the heart of the offenders at CAP and Media Matters. This, in turn, had a little backlash. He was, one of his progressive affiliations ended as a result of that, with the Truman Project severed their connection to him. So anyway, that's the kind of odd backdrop to all of this.
I mean, I would add on to that. I think it strikes me a bit even amusing that with our current Prime Minister, Bibi Netanyahu, who's focused so much on making this into a partisan issue, with all his focus, which is very, very clear in Israel, that the focus is going to Republican support. Or I wouldn't even say it's Republican support, a very specific style of Republican support, and then to actually say that's coming from the American liberal side and not from the Israeli side. But by the way, I would add that what's happening in Israel is a partisan issue. I mean, obviously it hasn't been dealt that way in the U.S. in the past, but I actually think a lot of what's happening is very healthy because to treat Israel as, and again, this is not an internal issue. I keep on saying Israel. It's actually Israel-Palestine. It's an international issue between two countries or two peoples. To treat it as if it's a non-political or non-partisan issue or non-ideological or non-value-based is absurd. I mean, obviously there are people here who believe in certain things, and that's why they're forwarding a certain agenda. And there are people who believe in other things, and that's why they're forwarding another agenda. And to sort of not see things through that political prism is just not politically correct.
Is this an issue that has stakes for you? I mean, the issue in America of whether the kind of bounds on your ability to criticize Israel are or are not expanded within the kind of mainstream of the Democratic Party. I mean, is that, do you pay attention to that because it matters to you in a practical way?
Sure. Yeah, of course. I mean, look, obviously the main focus of breaking the silence is in Israel, but as I said, this is an issue. It's definitely already an international issue, and it also has international repercussions, and it's also enabled partially because of international enablers. So very much, the conversation which is happening worldwide is interesting for us. That's why Israel spends millions and millions of dollars a year in advocating their position, in government's positions in various different places, because we're living in a global age, and definitely the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is very much globalized conflict. So obviously we're players in that arena. Sure. We're small players in that arena, but we are players in that arena.
Yeah, well, we're all small players. So on the actual issue itself, Israel-Palestine. Before we wind this up, let's quickly bring us up to date. There's a little action with a quartet coming up. Is that right? And we should remind people remind us what the quartet is, and then tell us what it's doing.
Well, in general, the quartet is quartet of representatives of four international political bodies, and where the idea is that it's another sort of, in our context, another monitoring group on trying to push forward Israeli-Palestinian peace. And as we spoke before about the international fantasy of if we just restart the political peace process, everything will be fine. So we're in another one of those phases now, and which I think what it was is there was a 4 months or a 3 or 4 months framework in which Palestinians said, we'll halt our what's called unilateral going to the UN and all of that. If we propose a map and you propose a map, Israelis propose a map within 4 months, that's supposed to end on the 26th of January. Israel and the U.S. actually have already started to try to postpone that date.
So the Palestinians did suspend their quest for statehood in the UN.
It's sort of it's not exactly. It's always worded differently. It's very hard to understand the exact.
I see, but in effect, they're saying, okay, we'll give you a few months to actually do something toward a two-state solution.
Yeah, and I mean, also the vote in the UN is also on a two-state solution. Of course, it's just a matter of how one
right. I
one
mean,
gets
through an alternative path, yeah, through the traditional negotiating path, yeah.
Sure. And I think here also lies. I mean, if we take it back to Breaking the Silence, is one of Breaking the Silence's main, I guess, political messages in that sense is I keep on saying this international fantasy, and the reason I use that word is because I think the international community, if it looks itself in the mirror, is fully aware that the process is non-existent and is leading nowhere. Yet there's this rhetoric which for some reason forces upon itself to try to work through negotiations anyway. And what people are forcing themselves not to see is that Israel is not interested at this point internationally or politically in ending the occupation. So it's not that we can't end it because of a lot of issues that we need to get over. We're not interested in ending it because we're actually happy with the status quo.
Can I just interrupt you and read again in this New York Post indictment of the Center for American Progress? They quote the Anti-Defamation League, Abe Foxman's group, their indictment of CAP. It says, quote, most of their blogs come from a perspective of blaming Israel for the lack of progress in Israeli-Palestinian affairs and minimizing or rationalizing the Iranian threat. So that is an item on the official indictment. I mean, it's part of the indictment whose bottom line is, as I understand it, that they are anti-Semitic to hold this view.
Right. Well,
so anyway, I would just point out that makes you an anti-Semite as well, in case you were wondering.
No, I mean, also I think there's a kind of funny game here. I mean, I don't know American politics well enough in that sense, but I don't know, and I don't know the ADL well enough, but I do know that I don't have any ability in like voting for them. Like I don't know who decides and who conceptualizes what's right and not right in that framework. And obviously, if at this point, to the best of my understanding, Israel is occupying the Palestinians, and the Palestinians are not occupying Israel. So obviously that puts a responsibility on us and not on them. And I say that, I say that sadly in the sense that the two-state solution will be agreed on by both parties, but the occupation will end. The occupation, which is a different issue than the two-state issue and the peace issue. The occupation is an Israeli-led policy, which was decided upon by the Israelis and will end only when the Israelis choose to end it. When I say that might not end the conflict between Israelis and Palestinians and our historical differences and all sorts of other things like that, but it will end our specific, very morally problematic policy towards the Palestinians. So to suggest that the occupation is some sort of mutually agreed upon structure between us and the Palestinians and we both have equal stakes is not to understand the very basic notion of occupation, which is one military sitting on another people's property. Now, if we end that and there will still be problems, sure, that doesn't mean we're not, there'll be peace, but I think one people controlling another people militarily in the long term is a wrong thing.
Yeah. Well, to play devil's advocate, which is something I don't normally do on this issue, probably, but sure. there are people in Israel who would say there are grave security concerns about turning the occupied territory over to the Palestinians. And they would like to do it. And it's not like there's no evidence to support them. I mean, the Second Intifada scared them to death.
Right.
And the problem was Palestinians coming over from the occupied territory. And so what their reply to you would be, look, it's just not so easy as saying, oh, well, we're the occupiers, so we'll get out. That's
right. No, of course there's a threat. I mean, and of course, if you use that logic sort of ad absurdum, you can say, then we should be occupying Lebanon, Syria, Egypt, Iran, Iraq. I mean,
some of those things have been tried actually and didn't work out well, but.
Fair enough, but I think, and here is the issue of understanding the political structure, because this is not just about understanding, sort of the rationalization. This is understanding. Before we understand the justifications, we needed to understand the context, and the context is that we have in order to deal with the threat some of which is real and some of which is a fear, we have decided to control a population indefinitely by our military. And that is something which is, for me, out of bounds morally. And I'm saying this rather conservatively in the sense that, I can fathom a situation in which temporary military occupations are justified morally, but long-term military justifications, to the best of my knowledge, are immoral, and that is because, as you like to say over at your side of the world, no taxation without representation. People should be in charge of their own destinies, and it is that's not. That's a value issue. I understand that there are people who don't believe in those values, but definitely in terms of in my people's history, I would suggest that we listen to those values much more. Sure, it will be easier for us to live if we are in constant control over our neighbors. And in that sense, I'm even going sort of not the utilitarian route. I'm not saying that it will blow up in the long run. It might not blow up in the long run. This might be sustainable militarily. I think we've done very well in the last 47 years or 46 years to show that this is sustainable militarily. It's not sustainable morally. If I'm an Israeli patriot, which I am, and which means that I believe that there's a moral justification for my independence, I can't do that on the basis of revoking somebody else's national independence. Mm-hmm. Now, it's so the claim that this is hurting our security is irrelevant to the issue at hand. The issue at hand is whether people have a right to live freely or not. And again, I think that's a relatively moderate issue. This is not something that's sort of coming from sort of like anarchistville. This is coming from sort of very basic democratic values which have been around for 300 years, 400 years.
Yeah, I mean, there are people who think it's coming from Apocalypseville, but that's an argument you can have. And then there are people like me who think the exact opposite, who think actually in the long run it's not sustainable. Israel ultimately, is hurting itself and so on. But that's a security argument.
No,
and it's interesting
and I agree with that. I agree with that. I'm just saying that point is regardless of the point. Mm-hmm. There's things which you're not allowed to do. That's my upbringing. Right. There are things which people don't do, and occupying military, just like dictatorships can be a good thing for people, and I still think dictatorships are wrong always. So too, I think long-term military occupations are wrong always. And somebody can argue with you and people have in the last 30 or 40 years, and some today, that dictatorships are good. I disagree. So.
Okay, well that's interesting. That fundamentally your motivation is a moral one.
Sure, of course, has to be. Yeah, has to be.
I mean, I guess mine is in the sense that I'm a utilitarian, so that the pragmatic and the moral considerations tend to merge when you look at it that way.
Well, definitely in debates.
Yeah.
But definitely. Sure.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Mikhael. That wasn't a bad pronunciation, right?
No, you're
except for all the the throaty stuff. I think it was more or less close. Anyway. Thank you. Continued good luck with your work, and maybe if you have time down the road, you can come back and talk to us again.
Oh, I would love to do so.
Okay.
Would love to do so.
Take care.
Have a good day.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.